much indeed, Mr Pritchard. Two-thirds of the North Yorkshire Moors National Park lie in the Scarborough and Whitby constituency, that glorious countryside that many of us will have seen on the Heartbeat television programme. And indeed, 79% of the North Yorkshire Moors and Pennine Special Protection Areas are managed as grouse moors. It is vital, I agree with the Honourable Lady, that we preserve that peat. The North Yorkshire Moors are not in the main blanket bog, they are dry heathland peat, so different ways of management need to be conducted on different types of moorland. And it's also vital that we preserve these fragile habitats, and to preserve these habitats, they do need managing. Heather moorland is rarer than rainforest. 75% of Europe's heather moorland is actually in the United Kingdom, and 60% of upland SSSIs are on moorland. Moorland has been managed for decades in traditional ways. As a child, I remember crossing the North Yorkshire Moors and seeing people cutting peat for fuel. Indeed, the legendary Saltersgate Inn had a fire that never went out because apparently a revenue man was buried under the fireplace, and it was the only way of preventing him being discovered. Sadly, the Saltersgate Inn is no more. But there's also, I think, important that we look at all ways of managing peat, particularly looking at arable degradation. As a farmer myself, I understand that, and also the way that horticultural peat is harvested, and indeed in the Republic of Ireland, who are phasing out their power stations, how we don't use peat for power. I must make the point that the North Yorkshire Moors isn't a natural environment. It's a very fragile environment. Indeed, in the Middle Ages, the moors were covered in trees which were cut down for fuel and to smelt the ironstone that was found under those moors. And it was only in the Victorian era that the management systems came in that encouraged sheep farming and grouse. And that involved cool burning of the heather in the winter period when the fire was unlikely to get into the peat itself during the 1st of October and the 15th of April. And that involves burning small patches of the moorland to create a patchwork of different stages of heather, some very tender and young. And of course, it's the tender young heather that the sheep and the grouse can feed on. The old woody heather is no good for the grouse and certainly no good for sheep. And also, by the way, no good for the ground nesting birds such as the golden plover, lapwing and curlew. If the Honourable Lady wants to come and see what happens to a moor if you don't manage it in this way, she should come to Troutsdale Moor, just outside Scarborough, that was not being managed as a moor for about the last 30 years, and that's reverted to scrubland. And there are none of the birds that we want to preserve on the North Yorkshire Moor. And indeed, if there were no sheep, who would mend the stone walls? According to the lady opposite, a unionised army of natural nature service people. But I think the farmers are the people that should be farming on the moorland and managing that. If we didn't manage the moorland as the way we do, I think we would see wildfires. In fact, burning creates fire breaks, and we've seen from the United States and Australia how when they stopped back burning, those fires got out of hand. In 2019, there was a record number of wildfires. And in fact, in 2020, that record was broken with 110 fires. And indeed, the Saddleworth Moor, on a moor that hasn't been managed in the way that we do traditionally on the North Yorkshire Moors, saw 3 weeks of fires which produced the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide as 100,000 car years and cost £20 million. That fire got into the peat. These wildfires get into the peat. That is what damages the peat. Controlled burning, I must make the point, does not burn the peat. It burns the vegetation. It allows the sphagnum moss, which forms more peat, and the young heather to regenerate. Mowing is not practical on most of the moorland because of the topography and the amount of stones, and indeed that encourages the growth of sedges, which can release large amounts of methane, which has a carbon factor 96% higher than CO2. And indeed, this is recognised by the North Yorkshire Moors National Park Authority itself. It is their policy to support the traditional rotational cool burning of heather to maintain that moorland in the way that the wildlife and the economic activities such as grouse shooting and sheep farming need. What I would say to the Ministry is I think we need to have more science before we make any decisions. I think the science is unfolding. And I think we also finally need to understand that there are some people who are against the burning of moorland because they're against grouse shooting. That's a perfectly respectable position to have. But don't use this as a way of actually destroying that very fragile environment on the North Yorkshire Moors. Because if we don't have a managed moorland, we'll have no grouse, no sheep, but we'll also have no lapwings and no curlews and no birds of prey too. So I hope that when the Minister responds to this debate, she'll understand that we need to do more work, because we do not want to destroy this very fragile, managed environment which has been kept that way for many, many years, and sacrifice that on maybe some political campaign which has to do with a lot of other things, but not just to do with managing moorland.
Well spoken.